An incident that will forever alter naval warfare took place on the evening of November 11th, 1940. The Regia Marina, the Italian Navy's major base at Taranto, in the Arch of the Italian Boot, was the target of an attack by the British Royal Navy. For the first time, capital ships were sunk while they were at rest in port by torpedo bombers fired from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious. The carrier, HMS Ark Royal, would deploy the same antiquated Fairey Swordfish biplane torpedo bombers that were used at Taranto on Bismarck, the German fleet's pride, in May 1941. A Swordfish torpedo would jam Bismarck's rudder in the last hours of daylight, leaving her defenseless and destined to perish at sea. In the encroaching darkness, every jet made a safe return to Ark Royal. The United States, the Empire of Japan, and Great Britain were the only three countries with active aircraft carriers at the time. The aircraft carrier would become the focal point of the Japanese attack force as they applied the lessons they had learned from these British triumphs. They would use 6 of their 10 carriers against Pearl Harbor, rather than just one. 9 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and 2 battleships backed the attacking squadron. The battleship, which had been the Ocean's Queen only 2 years before, would be reduced to a supporting position by the end of 1941. The United States learned a lot of the things that needed to be learned. Over Pearl Harbor, the smoke continued to drift, and the U.S. Navy leaders started to appreciate how fortunate they were that day that none of their aircraft carriers had been in dock. The attack's mastermind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was concerned in Tokyo that he had not destroyed America's carriers. He was aware of the new class of ships' increased value. In actuality, Japan was transforming 2 huge passenger ships into carriers and constructing 5 additional carriers. On December 7th, 3 of America's 6 fleet carriers, along with 1 escort carrier, were in the Pacific Ocean. At San Diego, one of them, Saratoga CV-3, was boarding aircraft. Vice Admiral Wilson Brown's sister ship, Lexington CV-2, was heading a convoy of 3 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers from Pearl Harbor to Midway Island to deliver 18-volt SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers for the island's defense. Enterprise, the 3rd carrier, was on her way back to Pearl after delivering 12 F-4F-3 Wildcat fighters and their pilots to Wake Island. Like the battleships, Enterprise would have been enmeshed in the slaughter if inclement weather hadn't delayed her journey home. Taken by the U.S. Enterprise in June 1941. Shortly after this picture was taken, the wooden flight deck was painted blue for camouflage. The failure of the Japanese to destroy the gasoline stores and their storage tanks at Pearl Harbor was as crucial to the Navy as the carrier's survival. This made it possible for the remaining Pacific Fleet to launch operations immediately and continuously, laying the groundwork for the next American offensives far earlier than they would have if the storage tanks and fuel oil had been destroyed. By the conclusion of that famous day, however, the only things standing between Japan and the U.S. West Coast were the 3 flat tops in the Pacific and their escorts. Saratoga left San Diego quickly the following day and went to Hawaii. When she arrived, she was tasked with fortifying Wake Island, which was under threat of invasion. Wake was defeated by the enemy before Saratoga and her assisting squadron could reach the scene due to delays, obstacles, and uncertainty. Saratoga and the other 2 carriers were given routine patrol and escort responsibilities after returning to Pearl. Officers and crew were not pleased with the inaction. They desired to engage in combat. Luckily, things were changing. In an effort to support the shattered Pacific Fleet, Enterprise's sister ship, Yorktown CV-5, weighed anchor in Norfolk, Virginia for the Pacific Ocean on December 16th. In 1940, Yorktown, who had been in the Pacific before, moved to Pearl Harbor with the fleet from San Diego. But in April 1941, she was moved there due to the growing threat of German U-boats in the Atlantic. She was now on her way back to Pearl as quickly as she could. Another pre-war image of the USS Yorktown. The carrier was lost at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, despite having been instrumental in the Marshall Islands campaign. The goal of pre-war naval strategists and architects was to ensure that all large ships' hulls could fit through the Panama Canal. Yorktown made the time-saving journey down the canal and reached San Diego Bay on December 30th. Although the strict width and length restrictions of their hulls restricted the size of new ships, it enabled the Atlantic and Pacific fleets to complement one another. She became the flagship of Task Force 17, TF-17, led by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. The destroyers Hughes, Sims, Russell, and Walker were also under his command, along with the heavy cruiser Louisville and the light cruiser St. Louis. The pre-war commanders in Hawaii, meanwhile, were axed in Washington. As part of a personnel shuffle, President Franklin D. Roosevelt named Admiral Chester Nimitz commander of the U.S. Navy on December 17th, Fleet of the Pacific as of December 31st. The first signs of offensive operations were emerging. Without delay, Admiral Nimitz and his team started formulating strategies for transitioning from defensive to aggressive warfare. Restoring or rescuing General Douglas MacArthur's stranded army in the embattled Philippines would be the sentimental decision at home, but this might have devastating consequences. Deep in Japanese-controlled waters, the Philippines was 4,500 miles from Hawaii. Any American relief operation would be easily surrounded, isolated, and destroyed as a result. Nimitz needed to strike so that his precious carriers had a way out. This implied that saving the Philippines was impossible. The primary goal of Washington's directives to Nimitz was to safeguard the shipping routes connecting the U.S. and Australia. The Japanese-held islands in the Marshall and Gilbert groups of islets and atolls, which were dispersed over hundreds of miles of water, posed the biggest threat to this crucial lifeline at the time. However, Nimitz wanted to know as soon as possible what to anticipate on and around those islands. He immediately sent the submarine Dolphin, SS-169, to reconnoiter the Marshalls in order to learn more. On Christmas Eve, the Dolphin skipper weighed anchor and departed Pearl Harbor as directed. After being seized from German rule during World War I, the Marshall Islands had been under Japanese authority ever since. The island group was given to the Japanese government as part of the League of Nations mandate. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese took control of the Gilberts, now Kiribati, which are located farther south and within striking distance of Fiji and Samoa. These two groupings of islands included several that were being reinforced with air and naval resources. From there, long-range flying boats and submarines that could refuel at these sophisticated bases, the easternmost outposts of the Japanese Empire, would pose a threat to the American lifeline to Australia, which is 4,000 miles from Hawaii. In addition to relieving some of the Japanese strain on the Philippines and the East Indies, Nimitz thought that an attack on these islands may significantly hamper the enemy's offensive capabilities and development. The American public would be reassured that the Navy was retaliating if the operation was successful. Some of his advisors were dubious because they didn't want to jeopardize the priceless aircraft carriers. One issue was the Japanese carriers' unidentified location, which could pose a major threat to the American carriers if they were close to the Marshalls and Gilberts. However, intelligence analysts and codebreakers were very certain that the Japanese flat tops were accompanying their big offensives in the Western Pacific. Luckily for Nimitz, on January 7th, Enterprise entered Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, the commander of the Enterprise Task Force, TF-8, was informed of the proposal and was pleased. He blunted any concerns with his self-assured arrogance. Hit hard, hit fast, and hit often was his military motto, and that's exactly what he now advocated. The initial assignment given to Fletcher in Yorktown at San Diego during these talks in Hawaii was to accompany the troop ships that were transporting 5,000 members of the 8th Marine Regiment to American Samoa for jungle training and garrison duty. Nimitz and Halsey arranged for Enterprise to meet the convoy when it arrived. In 1941, a Mark III aerial torpedo is dropped during training by an Enterprise-based Devastator. Nimitz formulated plans to launch a carrier strike against Japanese-occupied islands in the Marshall and Gilbert groups, while Yorktown and the slower transports were cruising towards Samoa. Enterprise, referred to by her crew as the Big E, would strike islands in the northern Marshalls under Halsey's overall command, while Yorktown would strike the Gilberts and southern Marshalls. The strategy called for Saratoga to conduct a defensive patrol west of Hawaii and Lexington to launch a third raid on Wake Island as a diversion. Paradoxically, pre-war planning had already outlined this tactic. Numerous situations involving possible allies and adversaries had been thought of. The plan, known as Rainbow 5, intended for raids on the Marshall Islands, which were occupied by the Japanese. In this scenario, Japanese stations in the Marshalls would be bombarded by 3 aircraft carriers, accompanied by supporting cruisers and destroyers, both by air and sea. 3 battleships would then be waiting to provide protection. Now that the battleships were out of commission, Nimitz and Halsey prepared a version of Rainbow 5 without them. Enterprise started supplying fuel and provisions for a lengthy journey on January 10, 1942. All night long, the job continued. The following day, she and her task force, TF-8, which included the heavy cruisers Northampton, Salt Lake City, and Chester, as well as their destroyer escorts, left Pearl Harbor. In keeping with the Rainbow 5 strategy, Halsey ordered his screening cruisers to bombard some of the target islands in order to give his air raid additional force. The cruiser group's commander, Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, was given this assignment. Things started to go wrong as soon as TF-8 departed Pearl Harbor for the meeting with Yorktown and TF-17. While screening Hawaii that evening, January 11th, the Japanese submarine I-6 fired a single torpedo at Saratoga. She would be out of commission for several months as a result of the severe damage, which forced her to retreat to the west coast for repairs. Then she got grim news as Lexington was steaming 2,000 miles toward Wake Island and her role in the impending raid. After the raid, the carrier and her thirsty task force could only be refueled by 1 elderly oiler. The Lexington squadron was unable to return to Pearl Harbor without refueling. The Enterprise's flight deck is used to test the 6 .50 caliber machine guns of a Grumman F4F4 Wildcat fighter. During combat, the Wildcat's guns had the regrettable tendency to jam. The elderly and sluggish Neches, AO-5, whose keel was first cast down in 1919, was the oiler assigned to Lexington. Neches was struck and sunk by 2 torpedoes from another Japanese submarine, I-72, early on the morning of January 23rd, while it was steaming around the prearranged rendezvous site. Lexington was forced to withdraw from the upcoming offensive raid since she lacked access to fuel oil. Half of the Pacific Fleet's carriers were inoperable prior to the start of the operation. However, that didn't stop the belligerent Halsey or Admiral Nimitz's ready assistance. The raid continued. Enterprise was waiting when Yorktown and the troop ships landed off the coast of Samoa on January 23rd. After the Marines safely disembarked with their equipment and guns, the 2 carrier groups began steaming northward toward their twin objectives on the 25th. Compared to most other U.S. carriers, both carriers enjoyed a distinct advantage. Navy vessels as well as every Japanese vessel. They were some of the first U.S. warships equipped with radar. This technology wouldn't be available to the Japanese until much later in the conflict, by which point it would be too late to change anything. Enterprise did not start refueling until after nightfall, a procedure that would take more than 5 hours, but all ships of the 2 task groups were refueled at sea on January 28th. At this stage of the war, refueling at sea at night was a novel and risky practice that would not become commonplace until much later. But on this particular night, it was a necessary experiment. Additionally, plans were prepared for both carrier groups' ships to refuel after the operation, before returning the 2,250 miles to Pearl Harbor. In the meantime, Enterprise would focus its air power on Woche and Taroa in the Maloelap Atoll in the northern end of the Marshall Island chain. Taroa is not to be confused with the more famous island of Tarawa in the Gilbert Group. Halsey assigned Fletcher and TF-17 the task of attacking the reported Japanese positions on Makin Island in the Gilbert Group and Jaluit and Mealy Atoll at the southern end of the Marshalls. The 2 carrier squadrons split apart to complete their assignments on January 29th. In January, as Nimitz was finalizing his plans, the submarine Dolphin reported that the Japanese had significantly increased their air and sea resources on the atoll of Kwajalein, located roughly 150 miles west of Woche. This new information made it impossible to ignore Kwajalein, since TF-8 may be seriously threatened by planes coming from there, Naturally, it would also be necessary to target this other island. The oil-rich East Indies, the obstinately contested Philippines, and the fight for strategically important Singapore were the Japanese's primary war goals at this time. The Marshalls and Gilberts appeared to be a safe backwater in their war plans after the American Pacific Fleet was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. Despite being the Empire's easternmost outposts, the island groupings had little defense. Naval interests there were represented by a single light cruiser and a few gunboats. Air assets included 9 land-based twin-engine bombers, 9 4-engine flying boats of the 24th Air Flotilla, and 33 older fixed-gear fighters. Only one new Zero fighter would be met. The majority of the 24th's resources were stationed at Truk, and they had just taken Rabaul. The Americans did not know the precise makeup of these forces. Belts of wounded .50 caliber ammo are carried by an armorer on board Enterprise toward a line of Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless dive planes preparing for the February 1, 1942, raid on the Marshall Islands. Just 7 weeks after the Pearl Harbor raid, on February 1st, 15 minutes before dawn, the first wave of aircraft from both U.S. carriers arrived over their respective targets simultaneously, thanks to the coordination of their air attack plans. Following their departure from Samoa, both carrier squadrons maintained search planes in the air all day to detect any enemy ships, submarines, or aircraft that could be hiding. At night, radar carried on the surveillance. Radio silence was enforced rigorously. The only means of communication between ships were semaphore flags during the day and signal lights at night. Her accompanying destroyers were detached to form a scouting line in defense of the carrier as Yorktown approached her designated targets. The flat top was continuously and closely screened by the cruisers. On February 1, 1942, a Curtiss SOC Seagull scout observation and float plane, left, flies over Wocha Island while the enemy airfield is being attacked. 2 fuel dumps and an ammo storage facility were destroyed by weapons from the USS Salt Lake City and USS Northampton. On February 1st, Yorktown started operations at 4:15 a.m. They launched 17 Dauntless dive bombers and 11 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers into the pre-dawn sky. The island of Jaluit, from where the Japanese ruled the Marshall Islands, was the first target. It was a challenging approach. Rain squalls, strong winds, and darkness concealed the assault planes from both the ground and one another. The wind-tossed planes had been dispersed by the time the island was reached, and a dark dawn finally materialized, and storm clouds had socked in the military installations. These circumstances made coordinated strikes impossible. On their own, each pilot gave it their all. 6 aircraft failed to return to their carrier due to the severe weather, low visibility, and excessive fuel consumption. Lack of training to fly in inclement weather or at night was a major cause in both vessels' aircraft losses. Under the strain of their initial combat flights, pilots lost their sense of direction in the windswept darkness. The Japanese were completely astonished and afraid that they might be attacked so quickly, even though not much damage was actually done to the targeted islands. However, when the news got home, Americans were ecstatic. Over Makin Atoll, where 2 4-engine, long-range Kawasaki HE-6K seaplanes, Allied designation Mavis, were destroyed while sitting on the water, the weather improved. As at Jaluit, Japanese confidence and nerves were greatly taxed, and a gunboat was also heavily damaged. Pilots dispatched to the third island, Mili Atoll, had nothing to assault, and the island was discovered to be deserted. The enemy's response was inefficient and delayed. At the end of the operation, however, 3 H-6K seaplanes managed to take off from Jaluit. The destroyer Sims was looking for the crew members of a jet that had been ditched when one of them discovered it. As the fast ship veered erratically, the Mavis launched a diving attack on Sims, but its stick of bombs landed harmlessly in the destroyer's wake. The plane was chased into adjacent clouds by anti-aircraft fire. The Battle of the Coral Sea would subsequently see the sinking of Sims. Now in danger, the destroyers requested air support from Yorktown. The carrier's Combat Air Patrol, CAP, launched 6 rugged Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters to target the flying boats, but no contact was established with the destroyers. However, just after 1 p.m., Yorktown's radar detected an approaching aircraft for the first time during combat. The Combat Air Patrol vectored its Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters in that direction. The Mavis was within 15,000 yards of the carrier when it emerged from the clouds. Wildcats piloted by Ensign E. Scott McCluskey and his wingman, Ensign John Adams, attacked the Kawasaki as it closed for an attack. The enemy's wing root exploded in midair after one of them inserted a burst into it. The relieved crew on Yorktown could hear the ecstatic McCluskey say over his intercom, "We just shot his ass off," thanks to the open PA system. McCluskey would go on to score 5 victories during the Battle of Midway in a desperate attempt to protect the doomed Yorktown. Yorktown lost 7 planes and 16 pilots, primarily as a result of accidents, contributing to the Gilberts' limited damage. Admiral Fletcher was ready to depart to refuel after his initial wave of attacks and then resume the assault. But Halsey gave him the order to return to Pearl Harbor. The hit-and-run attack had been executed with surprise, and he did not want to take the chance of losing to an enemy who had been informed. Both the distant Enterprise and Yorktown were simultaneously launching their planes into the darkness. Halsey ordered all ships to be outfitted for towing and being towed in anticipation of the raid. Under pressure, he wanted to be able to tow a crippled ship to safety without sacrificing time for the preparatory work. In order to defend against hostile machine guns, the Wildcat pilots persuaded the ship's outfitters to add boilerplate steel plating behind their cockpit seats during the journey from Hawaii. Although the steel made the planes heavier, it would save lives. Left. After flying his SOC Seagull to detect gunfire for his ship's attack on Taranto Island, Lieutenant Wilson Bartlett returned to USS Chester. Right. When a Japanese Kawanishi H-6K Mavis flying boat attacked Yorktown, Lieutenant Scott McCluskey shot it down. In order to reach the launch location before dawn without being noticed, TF-8 made its last run to the target at 25-30 knots as darkness descended on the night before the raid. Enterprise was just 36 miles from Woche, 106 miles from Taranto, and 156 miles from Kwajalein when she got on station. She turned into the wind for a 4:15 a.m. launch time, just like Yorktown. The first aircraft in the air were 6 Wildcats. When fuel ran low, they would rotate with new fighters and act as combat air patrol. This continued nonstop until the day's nightfall. Then, torpedo planes and dive bombers, equipped with 3 500-pound bombs instead of a torpedo, buzzed and roared toward the far-off Kwajalein Atoll. After they left, more aircraft were sent against Woche and subsequently Taranto. At approximately the same time, shortly before 7 a.m., the first wave of jets would pass over all 3 island targets if everything went according to plan. The pilots of Enterprise lacked nighttime operations experience, just like those on Yorktown. Once airborne, it was challenging to form up in the dark, and at least one fighter crashed into the sea while lost in the darkness. Halsey nervously observed the aircraft and their pilots from the Admiral's Bridge during takeoff. Until the final plane was retrieved in the afternoon, the man in overall command stood there gnawing his nails, chain smoking, and consuming endless cups of coffee. He was sidelined from the Battle of Midway due to the type of stress that would eventually cause a terrible shingles rash. Admiral Spruance led 2 of his cruisers, Northampton and Salt Lake City, to Woche Island for naval bombardment as the flat top threw her planes into the night. Due in part to the fact that flying boats from Woche had helped with the invasion of Wake Island, Woche was given preferential attention. On March 4, 1942, a month after the December 7th attack, 2 4-engine Kawanishi H-8K Emily flying boats based at Woche would be the sole Japanese to bomb Oahu. On February 1, 1942, the USS Salt Lake City cruiser shells Japanese-held Woche Island, where a bonanza of enemy aircraft were present. Air and sea were going to hammer the Japanese on Woche. Chester and 2 destroyers were also dispatched by Spruance to augment aircraft attack on Taranto. To find any ships inside the atoll's shelter, the torpedo bombers separated from the bomber and fighter formation as the American planes got closer to Kwajalein. Following, the dive bombers searched the northern island of Roy, which is home to the atoll's air base for defenses. As their fighter pilots scrambled to get their planes off the ground, the roar of approaching engines alerted the Japanese, who hurried to anti-aircraft weapons. The initial attack was carried out by 6 SBDs, which destroyed 2 small hangars, the base radio station, and at least 1 ammo dump. In the subsequent dogfights, the Wildcats defeated 3 Mitsubishi A5M Claude naval fighters with antiquated fixed landing gear, while 4 of the SBDs were shot down. In the meantime, it was discovered that the light cruiser Katori, which had been anchored in Kwajalein even prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, as well as a number of cargo ships and a few submarines were housed there. The opposition was unprepared for the initial strike. In the misty dawn, a little defense fire flared up. A merchant ship and subchaser were damaged by bombs. Additional planes were fired into the anchorage after American pilots radioed Enterprise that they had discovered a target-rich environment. On Kwajalein Island, another bomber squadron discovered an incomplete airfield. Although the nearby support facilities were destroyed and the runway was littered with bombs, there weren't many targets to pick from. However, there was an abundance of hostile aircraft on Taranto Island. Nearing full function, Taranto was the most easterly of all the Japanese air bases. It featured 2 runways longer than a mile and active aircraft. Only 5 Wildcat fighters, each carrying twin 100-pound bombs, were sent out in the initial wave since it was not anticipated that a significant enemy base would be on the little island. The 6th, as previously reported, was lost on takeoff. About 15 miles from Taranto, on the abandoned island of Deckhand, the lead jet unintentionally dropped its bombs. The defenders had time to start defensive measures once the blast informed them. Even worse, the exposed Enterprise was only a little more than 100 miles from Taranto. After dropping their last bombs, the Wildcats started strafing ground-based aircraft and buildings. Due to the attackers' lack of incendiary shots, damage was restricted. 3 of the Claudes were shot down in the brief combat, but 8 enemy aircraft managed to get into the air despite the fire from 4. 8-caliber guns on each plane. Now, at the most crucial time, a weakness in the F-4F Staunitz 50 caliber machine guns was revealed. They had a tendency to jam, and they did jam. The Wildcats broke off the dogfight with the Claudes and fled home without a weapon. The newly installed seat armor on one returning aircraft had 30 holes and dents in it, yet the pilot was spared. Every one of the 5 Wildcats went back to Enterprise. Following one of the missions, a fearless SBD-3 dive bomber makes its way back to Lexington. A tailhook crewman sprints to release the arresting wire at right. Fortunately, Lexington and Enterprise had both been at sea when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, so they were spared from destruction. The American planes that were attacking over Kwajalein broke off around 7:15 a.m. and returned to the carrier. Northampton and Salt Lake City opened up with their 8-inch guns on the island facilities, and some panicked Japanese merchantmen that were attempting to flee the anchorage for the open ocean. Admiral Spruance took this as an indication to release his cruisers. Salt Lake City would survive the war, and 2 nuclear bombs at Bikini Atoll before being destroyed as a target hull in 1948. Northampton would be lost in November 1942 at the Battle of Tassafaronga. At Taranto, Chester and the destroyers Barry and Maury came within 10 miles and moved forward in a line at 20 knots, with Barry in the lead. They launched an attack on the Beehive, which was now the enemy airfields fully awake, at 7:15 a.m. The cruiser became the focus of resentful and humiliated Japanese pilots. Chestertook was damaged by a bomb on her well deck. There were 38 wounded and 8 guys killed. She was targeted by another wave of bombers, but they completely missed her. The cruiser was persuaded to make a swift withdrawal by the near misses. Chester would live through the war and be scrapped in 1959. Returning pilots received a debriefing on Enterprise. It was clear that Taranto required more destructive care. Since all of the Wildcats were now expected to fly cap and safeguard the vital carrier, the others were excused. In order to handle the shipping in Kwajalein, 9 Dauntless torpedo bombers were en route there, this time equipped with torpedoes. They were not sent to Taranto because they lacked the necessary equipment to handle the planes there, but there were others, thankfully. At 9:35 a.m., 9 SBDs were fired at Tarawa, following a 35-minute refueling and rearming period. The majority of the Japanese aircraft were refueling and rearming on the ground when this second wave arrived at the island. There was no damage from the initial raid that the arriving pilots could determine. 2 brand-new, uncamouflaged hangars and a few other structures believed to be barracks or administration huts were damaged or destroyed in the 13,000-foot dive attack that emerged from the sun. 9 planes were destroyed on the ground by other munitions. When some Claudes attempted to confront the invaders, they were dismissed. All 9 SBDs went home, but nobody was able to sleep just yet. Throughout this time, Enterprise maneuvered to intercept and take off her aircraft, occasionally passing close to Woche Island. The Big E had to turn into the prevailing wind each of the 21 times it launched jets during the operation. At 10:15, planes were once more hastily rearmed and refueled in preparation for a third strike at Tarawa. After being rearmed and refueled, the SBDs flew into the wind once more before vanishing over the horizon and resurfacing over Tarawa. The enemy fighters were ready for them this time, and as soon as the SBDs got into range, anti-aircraft fire started. The radio station, fuel tanks, and other Japanese property were burned. The angry enemy pilots were unrelenting and brought down 1 aircraft in exchange for losing 2 of their own. Instead, then actively seeking out battle, the SBDs fired defensively before soaring into the 2,000, 4,000-foot clouds over the island. No one engaged the lone modern Zero fighter that was sighted. Admiral Halsey ordered all his ships to evacuate quickly once Enterprise had recovered all of her planes, including those on a second strike against Woche. The bombarding cruiser Chester and the approaching planes had been the Japanese's main targets. It was time to flee. The raid had been a hit-and-run attack, and Halsey did not want to risk anything. At full speed, 30 knots, Task Force 8 set out north. These quick withdrawals following a raid were dubbed "hauling ass with Halsey" by the sailors and airmen, who were worn out from their efforts but ecstatic about their success. At 1:30 p.m., radar detected approaching planes as they rushed to safety. The Allies named them Nell, and they were 5 Mitsubishi G3M, Type 96 twin-engine bombers. 3 bombs weighing 132 pounds each were mounted onto each Nell. With the intention of doing the same to the Big E, they had somehow armed themselves and took off from the smoldering ruins of Tarawa Airfield. They were intercepted by vectoring 4 of the Cap fighters. The American defenders were once more confronted with the jamming issue that beset the Wildcat's flight-caliber guns, and the Nells fled into the cover of a cluster of surrounding clouds. The Nells were about 3,500 yards off Enterprise's starboard bow when they emerged from the clouds. The assailants were immersed in a flood of lead from every ship's cannon that could be used. George Murray, the ship's captain, and a Navy aviator since 1915, gave the order to make a strong turn to port, and then a hard turn to starboard. All of the bombs fell into the sea and exploded as a result of the bombers' aim being confused by the squirming carrier and the wall of lead. Only 1 gasoline hose was damaged. It ruptured, caught fire, and burned a crewman to death. On February 1, 1942, crew members of the Enterprise shoot oncoming Japanese aircraft with their .50 caliber anti-aircraft weapons. Impotently, 4 of the aircraft headed home. Piloted by Lieutenant Kazuo Nakai, the 5th Nell trailed smoke and was too damaged to make it home. Nakai was adamant about crashing his aircraft into the carrier instead. His approach was marked by a shower of shells and bullets. Then one of the carrier's crew jumped into action. After leaving his watchpost, Aviation Machinist, Mate 3rd Class Bruno Gaido, leaped into the rear gunner's seat of a Dauntless dive bomber. When the plane was in the air, this was Gaido's station, but when it was on deck, it was not. He shot the incoming suicide bomber with the twin, 80 caliber back cannons of the aircraft. A vigilant Captain Murray gave the order for another hard starboard swivel at the last second. The death-bent bomber missed the deck and fell into the sea as a result of the sharp turn and Gaido's direct shot into the incoming plane's cockpit. However, Gaido's SBD was parked on the edge of the flight deck when its wing clipped and severed its tail. The aircraft stayed on deck despite spinning around. Before vanishing below decks, Gaido calmly climbed out of the wrecked aircraft and assisted in extinguishing a minor fire from the near miss. He feared that leaving his designated place would result in punishment. Halsey had witnessed the entire incident from the Admiral's bridge and had directed that the person in the rear gunner's seat be brought to him. Halsey inquired, "What is your rank, son?" As Gaido apprehensively stepped before his admiral. Gaido said, "AMM 3rd class, sir." Halsey, grinning proudly, said, "Well, you are AMM 1st class now," and immediately promoted him. Gaido's bravery has a tragic afterlife. His SBD, pierced with bullet holes, crashed into the water during the Battle of Midway. The Japanese destroyer Makigumo hauled him up and questioned him together with his pilot, Ensign Frank W. O'Flaherty. Their captors threw the two airmen into the huge empty ocean, where they drowned, frustrated by the Americans' refusal to provide information and the humiliating loss of their carriers. It wasn't until the conflict was over that they found out their fate. Following their near miss with the Nells, the Big E and her task group flew north. Halsey steamed on this track until nightfall, assuming the Japanese would search for the raiders near Hawaii. In Rainbow 5, everything went according to plan, but there were no battleships to rely on. The enemy had not finished yet. Before the Cap fighters could push the task group into the sea, a seaplane trailed it from a distance. Two more Nells then launched a bombing run at Enterprise around 3 p.m. Once more, the attacking bombers had near misses due to intense fire and quick maneuvers. One of the attackers was shot down by the Cap fighters, while the other flew home, trailing smoke. Halsey got his Cap fighters back after nightfall, but it was still full moon, and he moved northwest until he could hide beneath low-hanging clouds. He eventually headed home after a couple hours without seeing any radar pings. Next refueling, TF-8 reached Pearl Harbor on February 5th, followed by Yorktown and TF-17 the next day. Their accomplishments came before them, making others proud. Sailors applauded the successful raiders of both carriers and their escorts, while ship crews at anchor in the rubble of Battleship Row whistled. It was widely hailed as long-awaited good news, and was the first American offensive success in the Pacific War. With the recounting came exaggerated reports of the Japanese being harmed. The realization of more moderate evaluations would come after the war. The raid was both shocking and a warning to Japan. The planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had calculated that his fleet would have 6 months to rule a Pacific War without interference. As it was, less than 2 months had passed before Japanese absolute rule began. The raid made it plain to their naval planners that American aircraft carriers would need to be dealt with shortly, but it did not slow the Japanese juggernaut in the Far East. It started with the Marshalls and Gilberts raid. On February 20th, a bolder raid was scheduled. This time, Lexington bombed freshly seized Rabaul by steaming deep into enemy waters with a powerful escort of 10 destroyers and 4 cruisers. Regretfully, the squadron was discovered 350 miles from their target. The nearest ship was shortly overtaken by enemy bombers. 2 of Lexington's fighters lost their lives in a bloody battle that saw 18 Japanese planes shot down. Several bombs came close to hitting the ship, but none were hit. It came really close. The Americans chose to withdraw rather than launch an assault on Rabaul or try their luck. Admiral Halsey was ordered to launch a raid on Wake Island after his successful raid on the Marshalls. Enterprise was to be aided by 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers. Yorktown was supposed to join, but was diverted for another mission, so Halsey had to proceed without her. Peel Island, which is a part of the Wake Atoll, was to be bombarded by Northampton, Salt Lake City, Balch, and Maury, all of whom had participated in the bombardment of Woje and Taroa. Dauntless dive bombers swarm the Enterprise's flight deck as they get ready to strike Wake Island on February 24, 1942. The carrier is followed by the cruiser Salt Lake City and an unnamed destroyer. On February 24th, Halsey's squadron landed on post prior to sunrise. Bad weather caused the planes to be delayed in their launch, allowing the cruisers and destroyers to shell the coast before the carrier planes could reach them. Luckily, the Americans encountered very no resistance from fighters or bombers. Even though only 3 planes were lost, 2 due to mishaps and 1 to intermittent anti-aircraft fire, a significant amount of damage was done to Japanese infrastructure. There were no ships struck. Since the raid was deemed successful, another one was scheduled. The Japanese held Minami Torishima Island, often referred to as Marcus Island in the west, was the target this time. Located 600 miles northwest of Wake, this location was even closer to the Japanese nation. Only Northampton and Salt Lake City joined Enterprise this time. During an airstrike on February 24, 1942, a USS Enterprise Douglas TBD-1 Devastator torpedo plane flies over Wake Island, which is 2,300 miles west of Hawaii and part of the Marshall Islands group. Enterprise launched her aircraft just 125 miles from the island on a full moon before daybreak. The SBDs once more carried bombs weighing 100 and 500 pounds. Enterprise's radar operator used a novel strategy at the time, vectoring the planes to their target, while the island was obscured by dense clouds. Only one assaulting plane was destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, and no enemy aircraft were observed. Once more, an ambitious attack demonstrated that aircraft carriers could strike anywhere in the Pacific at any time, despite the scant damage. The next task for Admiral Halsey was to accompany Colonel Jimmy Doolittle on his raid on Tokyo. In retaliation, Japan planned to assault Midway in the hopes of attracting and sinking the American carriers. Rather, Japanese naval dominance and striking powers would be irreparably blunted at the end of the great carrier combat of World War II. Later in 1942, as the two navies engaged in a slugfest near Guadalcanal, they found themselves engaged in an attrition-based battle in which neither side would back down and both would severely punish the other. The American production miracle gradually overtook the Japanese, speeding up the eventual end. A whopping 78 escort carriers, 9 light fleet carriers, and 17 fleet carriers would be produced by the American manufacturing powerhouse. Under mounting pressure from a powerful adversary, the Japanese were unable to keep up.